In the winter of 2004, a plainclothes police officer stood in line at a fast food restaurant in Texas. Casually, he turned to scan the room. The man appeared to be simply looking around, glancing at the establishment and other customers, just as many people do while waiting in line. But in reality, his focus was on two individuals dining by the window. At the mere sight of them, his hair stood on end. Instinctively, the officer reached for his weapon, concealed beneath his shirt. Signaling to his partner, he headed straight for the table by the window, revealing his cover. At dawn on June 18, 2004, the Burnett County Emergency Services in Texas received a report of a burning vehicle. The caller had been driving to work when he noticed a car that had veered off the road and was engulfed in flames. This stretch of road was narrow, winding, and lacked any guardrails, making it a frequent site of accidents, especially when deer would suddenly dart onto the roadway. Firefighters were dispatched immediately to the scene. The blaze was incredibly intense. The vehicle had been completely consumed by the fire. Its tires melted, and no trace of paint remained on the body. Essentially, only the frame was left, making it difficult to determine the exact make and model of the car. The driver's body was inside, or rather, what remained of it. Emergency responders had never seen anything like it before. Typically in fires, the skin and some muscle tissue burn away, but the skeleton remains intact. In this case, barely a quarter of the body was preserved, and the skull had completely disintegrated into fragments. Soon after emergency responders arrived at the scene, another car pulled up. A woman jumped out and introduced herself as Lori Daniels. She explained that her son, Clayton Daniels, was supposed to take this road the previous evening on his way to her home in Marble Falls. Clayton had planned to pick up some car parts from his mother and drop off a box of books for her, but he never arrived. That morning, Lori's daughter-in-law, Clayton's wife, Molly Daniels, called her. Molly sounded slightly annoyed because she and Clayton shared a car, and she needed it to get to work. But Clayton still hadn't come home. Lori was confused because her son had never shown up at her house, and she assumed he had changed his plans. It appeared that Clayton had left home around 11 p.m. His mother, not seeing him arrive, figured he had decided otherwise. Molly, in turn, assumed Clayton had stayed overnight at his mother's house. That meant the young man had been missing for several hours before anyone realized it. Since Molly didn't have the car, the two women decided that Lori would drive along the route Clayton usually took and see if she could find him. Needless to say, she was terrified when she saw emergency vehicles on the road. After speaking with the police, Lori called Molly to tell her about the accident. When Molly was finally able to arrive, she explained that Clayton had been driving a 1999 Chevrolet Cavalier. The car belonged to an acquaintance of hers who had allowed Molly to use it temporarily. The burned-out vehicle that firefighters had just extinguished closely resembled that model. Everything pointed to Clayton Daniels being the victim. The items found inside the car further reinforced this assumption. Despite the fire's destruction, some belongings that had belonged to Clayton remained, and Molly was able to recognize them. Up until that moment, she had managed to keep herself together, but now she completely broke down. She screamed, cried, and fell into a hysterical fit. Molly and Clayton were a very young married couple. She was 20 years old and he was 22. They lived in Leander, a suburban area of Austin, Texas. Molly worked as a secretary at a local construction company and was well regarded as an employee. Clayton was a mechanic, but he had been out of work for some time. Because of this, he stayed home with the kids: 4-year-old Caleb, Molly's son from a previous relationship, and their 1-year-old daughter, Harley. They had named the girl Harley because Clayton was passionate about Harley-Davidson motorcycles. The children adored him, especially Caleb. Now 2 kids were left without a father, and Molly, at just 20 years old, was a widow. Meanwhile, officers examined the road and found no signs that the vehicle had attempted to brake before rolling off the embankment. Their initial assumption was natural. Driving on a dark road late at night, with almost no other cars around, Clayton, exhausted after watching his young children all day, may have fallen asleep at the wheel. The officers wouldn't have been surprised to learn that he had a drink or two before driving. Despite Molly's emotional state, they had to question her. First, they asked if Clayton had a habit of drinking. Molly admitted that he occasionally indulged in alcohol, but she insisted that on that particular night, he hadn't been drinking. She had seen him completely sober before he left. Besides, he was young, healthy, and physically strong. It was unlikely that he would have suddenly felt so unwell that he couldn't handle the situation on the road. The remains of the body were unusually scarce, but detectives still hoped that the autopsy would provide some answers. Even though the teeth hadn't survived, the medical examiner managed to find a small piece of lung tissue. To his surprise, there was no soot present. The key fact about fire-related deaths is that people don't die from the flames themselves, but from inhaling smoke. So the absence of soot in Clayton's lungs was highly suspicious. It suggested that he had died before the fire even started. In his report, the medical examiner stated that the cause of death was undetermined and that further investigation was required, adding yet another mystery to the first 24 hours of the case. By this point, everyone understood that Clayton had burned to death in the car. However, it was necessary to officially confirm that it was indeed him. Since the fire had destroyed even the victim's teeth, the only accurate way to identify the driver was through DNA analysis. Specialists collected DNA samples from both the victim and Clayton's mother. Both samples were sent to the laboratory for testing, but it would take several months before the results were ready. Meanwhile, upon hearing about the tragedy that had befallen the Daniels family, people rushed to help Molly, who was mourning the loss of her husband. Tough times had arrived for her. Before, her husband always took care of the children, but now Molly had to either send the kids to daycare or find a nanny. However, she didn't have the means to afford it. That's when her neighbor offered nanny services for $120 a week. This was a very favorable offer, especially considering that she had 2 children. Molly's colleagues also chipped in, giving her $1,000 for expenses, paying her electricity and water bills, and filling her fridge so that she and her children wouldn't go hungry. Meanwhile, specialists examined the vehicle to understand what led to the fire. From a mechanical standpoint, the car was in good condition. However, there was one oddity. Typically, fire starts under the hood and moves towards the back of the vehicle. In this case, though, the first area to ignite was the passenger side seat. Moreover, the experts believed that the source of the intense fire was fuel from the gas tank, but the fire never reached it. Laboratory analysis of samples from the car revealed traces of an accelerant on the driver's seat. This meant that Clayton's death was not an unfortunate road accident. Someone had deliberately set the fire, clearly intending to kill the young man. Trying to understand who might have wanted such a terrible death for Clayton, detectives unexpectedly discovered that he had many enemies. In addition to his extremely volatile character, which led him to get into fights over any reason, he had already attracted the attention of the law. 10 days before the incident, Clayton pleaded guilty to sexual assault. When he was 16, he sexually assaulted his 7-year-old cousin. The girl took almost 7 years to find the strength to go to the police. She reported that Clayton not only sexually assaulted her, but also beat her. Clayton denied the assault, as if he didn't raise his hand against his 7-year-old cousin and only assaulted her, it would somehow make a difference. In any case, Clayton was sentenced to 30 days in jail and 10 years probation. After the sentencing, the girl's family, particularly Clayton's uncle, were enraged. In their opinion, this was some sort of mockery of justice, not a sentence for a rapist. They even threatened Clayton with death. Of course, Clayton's uncle immediately became a suspect in his murder, as his desire for revenge on his niece's abuser was obvious. But the man had a strong alibi. Therefore, he was immediately excluded from the list of suspects. However, that didn't change the fact that Clayton was disliked in the town. It was so bad that even at his funeral, where it's customary to say only good things about the deceased, Clayton's best friend, bidding him farewell, said that the world will be better without him. The investigators decided to speak with Molly, hoping she would list people with whom Clayton had conflicts. However, the woman suddenly tried to steer the investigation in a completely different direction. She said that Clayton was afraid that the assault charges would prevent him from spending time with their children. She claimed that he had been depressed due to the problems that had piled up on him and might have decided to end everything himself. The investigators could not believe their ears. From their experience, they knew that even if the deceased had indeed made such a decision on his own and wasn't murdered, family members would deny the obvious until the very end. They refused to believe that someone they loved could do such a thing to their own life, and they certainly wouldn't express such an assumption themselves. But even if Molly were one of those people who view the world without rose-colored glasses, no one would dare to commit self-immolation because it is unbelievably painful. Overall, Molly's behavior was surprising. Her initial hysteria was replaced by complete emotional detachment, even seeming indifference. The detectives asked her directly about this, and Molly replied that people grieve in their own way and that she does it without witnesses. However, aside from that, Molly was openly irritated. The investigators' questions seemed to annoy her. This was strange for a grieving widow who was left with 2 young children to care for. The detectives decided to examine the family's life and began with their financial situation. It turns out that Clayton, the mechanic who had been out of work, was insured for $100,000. However, the insurance company was unwilling to pay out the money until DNA testing confirmed that the body belonged to Clayton. The employees of the insurance company complained to the police that Molly was putting intense pressure on them, almost demanding that they pay her the money on a daily basis. On one hand, the detectives knew that she needed the money, but on the other hand, her behavior raised suspicion. The police began to suspect that the young widow might have had something to do with her husband's untimely death. However, they were confused because everyone they spoke to confidently stated that Molly truly loved her husband and had been happy with him. Unsure of what to think, the police decided to set up surveillance on the woman. And the detectives discovered that the woman who adored her husband, Molly, had already found a replacement for him. Molly's sister, Melissa, told the detectives about a visit she made to her sister's house when she needed to use the bathroom. The bedroom door was open and the girl saw a man sleeping on the floor in the wardrobe. She was horrified when she noticed his bare legs sticking out from the closet. She immediately ran to her sister to tell her what she had seen. Molly told her sister to wait in the kitchen while she went to check. When Molly called her sister into the bedroom, there were jeans and shoes scattered near the wardrobe. Molly told her sister that she had mistaken the scattered men's clothes for a man. Melissa pretended to agree, but she knew very well that she had seen naked male legs, not jeans. Intrigued by the mysterious new man in Molly's life, the detectives spoke to her neighbors. They learned that the girl had started dating a new young man immediately after her husband's death. 2 weeks after the tragic incident, he had already moved into her home. His name was Jake, and he worked as a truck driver, which is why the neighbors rarely saw him. So insurance, Clayton's murder, and Molly's new boyfriend. All of this pointed to the possibility that Molly and her lover had planned and carried out Clayton's murder in order to get him out of the way and collect the insurance money. But before the police could investigate the new boyfriend, 6 months after the incident in December, the detectives received the results of the DNA analysis. The deceased was not Clayton. It wasn't even a man. 6 months ago, an unknown woman had burned to death in the car. This new information turned the entire investigation upside down. If this wasn't Clayton, then who was it? The detectives had no idea what had happened that night 6 months ago, or where Clayton was in this case. The officers checked missing persons reports to see if any woman had gone missing around the time the car had caught fire, but they found nothing of the sort. The detectives hit a wall trying to identify the victim. As the police continued to observe Molly, the officers became convinced that the young woman had started a new romance. They saw a handsome brunette leaving her house to meet Molly after work. He kissed her, hugged her, and they both entered the house together. In general, 6 months after her husband's death, Molly's life seemed to have more or less settled into a routine. She would drive to work, stop by the store after work for groceries and other errands, and return home. One day, as usual, Molly drove away from work and approached the parking lot near a row of stores. However, instead of entering one of them, she approached another car where a man was sitting behind the wheel. Molly got into his car and together they drove to a Taco Bell fast food restaurant on the northwest side of Austin. The officer observing them saw how the young couple ordered food and sat down to eat by the window. The officer didn't see anything suspicious in this, but it was noticeably different from Molly's usual routine, so he decided to act. He called for backup, and together with 3 other officers, they came up with a plan. One of the officers, dressed in civilian clothes, entered the restaurant to buy a Coke. While standing in line, he casually looked around as if surveying the establishment and the other patrons. However, his main focus was the couple by the window, Molly and her new boyfriend. Suddenly, he noticed something that made his eyes widen in disbelief. He forgot about his cover and his role as a civilian. His hand instinctively reached for his concealed weapon. He signaled to his partner standing nearby and moved directly toward the couple by the window. The officer approached the table, never taking his eyes off the man. He recognized him, even though he had transformed into a brunette. Sitting before him and eating a burrito was none other than Clayton Daniels. The young man appeared visibly startled, but quickly regained his composure and claimed that the officer was mistaken. His name was Jake, he explained. He showed a driver's license under the name Jacob Alexander Gregg and said he was a friend of Clayton's. The document appeared legitimate. However, the officers remained convinced of their findings. They detained Jake and Molly. Jake didn't resist, but Molly had a meltdown, shouting that they couldn't arrest her because she hadn't done anything wrong. Both were taken to the station, but neither of the detainees wanted to talk to the police. The officers quickly confirmed that Jake was, in fact, Clayton Daniels, somehow having obtained fake documents. Clayton had staged his own death. This was now indisputable. But another important question remained: the body in the car. Did Clayton kill someone and plant the body in the vehicle? Neither of the spouses admitted to anything. Molly only claimed that Clayton had allegedly reappeared a month after the incident, as if nothing had happened, and that was all she knew. As is often the case, criminals don't want to talk to the police, but they are more than willing to communicate with other inmates. A cellmate of Clayton's reached out to the detectives, claiming that Clayton boasted about how cleverly he had come up with the idea to dig up the body at the cemetery. He explained that Clayton got into trouble and wanted to disappear, so he dug up the body and staged his own death. The detectives tried to speak with Molly again, and she admitted that she knew where Clayton had buried the body. She described the approximate location of the necessary grave. Armed with this information, the police found the necessary cemetery. Although half a year had passed, they discovered a disturbed grave with signs that the soil had been dug up. Additionally, the decorative elements that should have been standing nearby were scattered around. Upon digging up the grave, the officers realized they were not mistaken. The tomb showed signs of being tampered with by some kind of tool. It was empty. A DNA comparison between the pillow from the grave and the body of the victim from the burned car showed a match. The victim turned out to be 81-year-old Charlotte Davis, who had died of natural causes 6 months before the staged death. She had spent nearly her entire life in a nursing home due to developmental disabilities. She had almost no family or friends, but the staff at the nursing home had cared for her. They told the detectives that Charlotte was terrified of fire and did not want to be cremated. The nursing home staff understood that cremation was cheaper than burial, but out of respect for the woman's wishes, they collected funds to buy a coffin and bury her. They were proud and happy to have been able to give Charlotte a proper funeral. Therefore, when they were informed that the deceased body had been exhumed and used for a crime, soaked in lighter fluid and set on fire, they were horrified. Now it was clear why the body had burned so intensely. It had been embalmed, and embalming fluid is highly flammable. Finally, Clayton admitted to the crime, but this was not enough for the police. The detectives were certain that Molly had helped him. Now it was just a matter of proving it. They seized all the gadgets from the family home and the computer that Molly used at work, and they were fortunate that Molly had caught a virus on her work computer. Their luck lay in the fact that the virus had installed a keylogger, or keyboard activity recorder, to steal Molly's passwords. The virus saved everything in a text document, which allowed the police to learn everything the girl had done or searched for on the computer. She had searched for information on burned bodies, how a car burns, how cremation works, and how to dispose of a body to avoid DNA preservation. She was also interested in websites where one could order fake documents. The detectives shared everything they had discovered with Molly, and she decided to confess. She had been involved in planning the crime from beginning to end. Although she and her husband did not actually kill anyone, the cynicism and coldness of their plan was shocking. Molly explained that she and her husband were deeply concerned about the charge of molestation. Although Clayton was only facing a month in prison, he would be a registered sex offender for the rest of his life. This meant they would lose their home and would have to move. Clayton wouldn't be able to take their children to and from school when they grew older. In general, he couldn't care for the children the way he used to, and that would significantly affect their lives. Moreover, for a family barely making ends meet, $100,000 in insurance money would be a huge help. Of course, Molly insisted that the issue was not about money, but it was hard to believe that. After all, they had plans for that money, and she had been openly talking about waiting for the payout, not hesitating to take advantage of the generosity of those who had helped her. So the couple came up with a plan to officially kill Clayton. They needed a grave that was rarely visited so that no one would notice the coffin had been dug up. Clayton went to the cemetery and dug just such a grave without caring that it was a woman's grave. He exhumed Charlotte Davis from her coffin, dressed her in his own clothes, placed her in a car, pushed the car off the road, and set it on fire. He then hid nearby on a motorcycle. The couple planned to wait for the insurance payout and then head to Mexico, where Clayton would undergo plastic surgery to alter his face and visit a dentist to work on his teeth. Molly also wanted a tummy tuck while they were there. Clearly, she intended to indulge herself. The accomplices planned to leave just 2 weeks later if they weren't arrested. Meanwhile, Clayton carefully disguised himself, dyeing his hair and beard. They had spent a lot of time and effort planning and executing their scheme, but it was unclear how they would manage to deceive their friends and family for the rest of their lives. Could Clayton's own mother, who would surely visit her grandchildren and check on Molly, not recognize her son, his voice, gestures? In any case, Molly and Clayton were convinced they had thought of everything, and they couldn't resist the pleasure of having a meal together at Taco Bell. Both spouses were charged with arson, grave desecration, and Molly was additionally charged with obstruction of justice. Since Clayton was already facing charges of sexual assault with aggravating circumstances against a minor, and there was plenty of evidence, both decided to plead guilty. As there was no trial, the public didn't know anything until the sentencing of Molly, when all the horrifying details of her actions were revealed. For example, Molly told her 4-year-old son Caleb that this new man who looks like Daddy is not Daddy. Daddy is in heaven, he died, and this is Jake. In general, neither Molly nor her husband showed remorse for their actions. Molly, bewildered, and asked, "Why are you so concerned about a dead person? You're religious people, and you believe her soul is in heaven. It's just a body." And she truly didn't understand why her actions were so shocking. Clayton was sentenced to 30 years in prison and Molly to 20 years. Molly divorced Clayton in 2010 while both were in prison. She served 12 of the 20 years and was released in 2016. Molly moved to Florida, reconciled with her mother, who was horrified by her crime, and maintains a good relationship with her now adult children. Although they divorced, it was reported that she lives alone, so it's possible she might still be waiting for him. Clayton is set to be released in 2033. What an irony. He didn't want the charge of molestation to change his life, and he didn't want to spend 30 days in prison, so he'll serve 30 years and will likely struggle to truly rebuild his life after release. Charlotte Davis's body was reburied. This time, the sheriff's office purchased the coffin to give the woman a dignified farewell. Do you get along with your neighbors? In a world where even the closest family members can turn out to be liars, traitors, or murderers, it is often the people we have lived next to for years who unexpectedly become a source of safety, stability, and justice. They see us every day, hear our voices, and are capable of noticing the smallest details. Details that can lead to solving a crime when the police and prosecutors have given up. A missing anchor, stolen valuables, but most importantly, a neighbor's keen observation helped detectives uncover what happened to the suddenly vanished Jeanette Pirro and Christopher Chris Benedetto. They say every cloud has a silver lining, and Christopher, or Chris Benedetto, experienced this firsthand. Since childhood, Chris had been passionate about fishing, and whenever possible, he would leave his hometown of New York for Florida to fish and relax on the beach. The rest of the time, he worked as a carpenter and ran a small business. While renovating his sister's house, Chris met an interior designer, Jeanette Pirro. Sparks flew instantly between them. They were drawn to each other, and working on the house together allowed them to spend a lot of time in each other's company. In 1990, Chris and Jeanette married in their beloved state of Florida. Everything was going great until, 5 years later, Chris fell from scaffolding and broke his spine. The injury was severe, requiring multiple surgeries. To help support his back, doctors implanted 4 steel rods into his spine. He received a $2 million settlement from insurance companies and contractors, a sum that seemed substantial at the time. But Chris and Jeanette needed that money because he knew he would never be able to work again. He had to take strong painkillers and wear an orthopedic brace for back support. His doctor advised him to leave New York, warning that if he ever slipped on ice and fell, he could be permanently disabled. Since both Chris and Jeanette loved Florida, and the climate there was much milder, they decided to relocate. They bought a home on Singer Island, along with a fishing boat, and embraced their new lifestyle. Chris and Jeanette loved their life by the ocean. Their faces reflected their joy, and they quickly became part of the Singer Island community. They befriended their neighbors and spoke with them every single day. That was the case until the evening of Wednesday, November 11th, 1998, when the couple had planned to have dinner with their neighbors. However, they never showed up and didn't inform anyone. Something very unlike the usually polite, considerate, and courteous Jeanette and Chris. Thursday came and went, then Friday, but no one had seen them. By the weekend, newspapers had piled up at their doorstep, forming an increasingly noticeable stack. Their mailbox remained untouched. Their neighbors grew seriously concerned. The neighbors decided to check something. In their community, it was common practice for everyone to have spare keys to each other's homes, so someone could keep an eye on the house when a family went on vacation. Using their keys, the neighbors entered Chris and Jeanette's home to see if their suitcases were still there. What they found was alarming. The suitcases remained in the house, as did Chris's wallet and phone. His essential medications, which he couldn't go without for long trips, were still in the fridge. However, Chris's Toyota 4Runner SUV was missing from the garage. The neighbors turned to Ben Demonstranti, who lived across the street with his family. Chris and Jeanette had bought a deep-sea fishing boat but had nowhere to dock it, so Ben had generously allowed them to use his pier. Because of this arrangement, the two families were close. Chris often shared his fresh catch with Ben, and since he went out to sea every day, the men saw each other regularly. But Ben hadn't seen Chris for several days either, and he hadn't been able to reach the couple by phone. Not knowing what to think, the neighbors contacted Jeanette's sister Regina, who lived with her family in New Jersey. But Regina had no idea that her sister and brother-in-law had planned any trip. They hadn't called or mentioned anything about leaving town. Growing more worried, the neighbors reported Chris Benedetto, 42, and Jeanette Pirro, 45, missing to the police on November 16, 1998, 5 days after they were last seen. The authorities launched an investigation, starting with a search for the missing Toyota 4Runner, believing that if they found the vehicle, they might find Chris and Jeanette. Naturally, upon learning about her sister and brother-in-law's disappearance, Regina couldn't just sit idly by. She and her husband reached out to Chris's brothers to inform them of the situation. Regina's husband, Michael Koblin, promised to fly to Florida himself to find out what had happened to Chris and Jeanette. That same day, Monday, November 16th, Michael arrived on Singer Island from New Jersey. He met with the neighbors and told them the same thing he had told Chris's brothers, that he would do everything he could to uncover the truth. Knowing how much Chris and Jeanette loved being on the water, Michael visited several marinas, asking around. Eventually, he learned that the couple had taken a friend's boat to the Bahamas and that they were expected to return soon. By Monday evening, employees at a local hotel called the police. After seeing the news about the search for a Toyota 4Runner, they noticed a vehicle matching the description parked near the hotel. When officers arrived to check the license plate, they confirmed that it was Chris's SUV. This led the police to believe that the couple might have parked the car there, met up with friends at the hotel, and then left with them on their boat for the Bahamas. By the 6th day of the couple's disappearance, the police saw little cause for concern. However, Chris's two brothers were growing increasingly worried that the couple had not returned. They began to suspect that something might have happened to them along the way. Despite the fact that the route from Singer Island to the Bahamas was one of the easiest crossings, taking only about 3 hours, late November brought unpredictable conditions. Winds and currents could quickly turn a pleasant trip into a deadly trap. Additionally, the brothers couldn't understand when Chris and Jeanette had supposedly left. Was it on the night they missed dinner? Or the following day? None of it made sense. Such impulsive behavior was completely out of character for the couple. They would never leave without telling anyone. And if they had planned to be gone for an extended period, they would have taken at least one suitcase and Chris's essential medication. Determined to get answers, the brothers traveled to Florida to investigate in person. They stayed at Chris and Jeanette's house, and being law enforcement officers in New York, they knew exactly how to conduct a search. They handed out flyers, questioned locals, and went door to door, hoping to gather any useful information. But after a week of searching, they had learned nothing new. With no fresh leads, they had no choice but to return home. Before leaving, they decided to unplug some non-essential electrical appliances to avoid unnecessary power consumption in the empty house. As they walked through the house, looking for appliances to unplug, Chris's brothers entered the garage. There, they noticed a small chest freezer where Chris usually stored his catch and bait. But something was off. It had been pushed under a table, as if someone had deliberately moved it to hide it from view. Curious, they opened the freezer. At first, they couldn't comprehend what they were seeing, but then it hit them. The frozen body of a person was crammed inside. The freezer was small, meaning someone had to go to great lengths to force an adult's body into it. The victim was positioned head first, making identification difficult. But after a closer look, the brothers realized it was Jeanette. Shocked, they immediately called the police. Detectives rushed to the scene. Now they had a body and a crime scene, but also a major problem. Neighbors, Michael Koblin and Chris's brothers, had all been inside the house, searching for clues about Chris and Jeanette's whereabouts. They had touched various objects with their bare hands while trying to determine what the couple had taken with them. This meant that any forensic evidence found at the scene could be compromised. The medical examiner arrived at the scene. Since Jeanette's body was frozen to the inside of the chest freezer, he decided to transport the entire freezer along with the victim. Due to the effects of freezing, the pathologist stated that determining the exact date and time of death would be impossible. However, in a stroke of luck for the investigation, the freezing process had preserved the body in near-perfect condition. Rigor mortis had never had a chance to set in, and caused decomposition-related changes. Even though more than 2 weeks had passed since the murder, the pathologist was able to identify clear signs of strangulation. The killer had wrapped a rope around Jeanette's neck twice and strangled her to death. So the wife was found murdered, strangled in their home, while the husband was missing, and his car had been abandoned near a hotel. It was no surprise that detectives immediately considered Chris a suspect. Even though friends and neighbors insisted that Chris and Jeanette had a wonderful, trusting relationship and were happy in their marriage, investigators knew better. Experience had taught them that no one truly knows what happens behind closed doors. Could there have been something going on in their lives that even their closest friends and family had no idea about? But how could they find Chris now? If he had killed his wife and fled, he had a 2-week head start to evade the police. In today's world, investigators might try tracking a fugitive's smartphone or mobile data, but in 1998, the police could only rely on Chris's bank accounts. However, none of Chris's accounts had been used. He hadn't withdrawn money or used his cards. It was a dead end. That is, until a breakthrough came from Chris and Jeanette's neighbor, Ben Demonstranti. Ben had been thinking a lot about the case because he was a close friend of the couple. Suddenly, to his own surprise, he realized that he was the last person to have heard from Chris. Ben had previously worked as a beach lifeguard, and he knew that even the smallest detail could turn out to be crucial. So he contacted the police and revealed that on November 11th, he had heard Chris leave to go fishing, as he usually did. It was around 8 a.m. Ben hadn't seen Chris, but he had heard his voice as Chris said to someone, "Grab the fishing rods." After that, the boat's engine started and they went out fishing. A couple of hours later, the boat returned, but Chris wasn't on it. The boat was being driven by a man Ben didn't recognize. The man left the boat in its place, walked to Chris's car, started the engine, and drove off. At the time, Ben didn't think much of it, but now, in light of the recent events, he replayed the details in his mind. 2 people had gone out on the boat, but only one had come back. Given what had happened to Jeanette, Ben began to suspect that Chris hadn't returned because he had met the same fate as his wife. The investigators shared Ben's concern and asked him to describe the unfamiliar man. Ben explained that he was a large man with a round face, graying hair, and he appeared to be between 40 and 50 years old. The detectives immediately thought of Chris's brothers, who fit that description. They asked Ben if they could arrange for the suspects to pass by his house. Would he be able to identify the man? Ben assured them he would. At the same time, forensic investigators were examining Chris's boat and SUV. Both were impeccably clean, gleaming with spotless condition. While Chris was known to be a tidy person, this level of cleanliness was surprising, especially since the boat, which he used daily for fishing, didn't even have traces of fish blood. However, the forensic team did find something interesting. First, on the boat, they discovered a rope that was the same size and shape as the one used to strangle Jeanette. Secondly, they noticed that the spare anchor was missing. Sometimes boat owners prefer to have 2 anchors on board for added safety, but the second one is almost never used. This led investigators to question why the spare anchor was gone and whether it could be a clue to the whereabouts of Chris Benedetto. Later that same day, the police organized an impromptu identification with Ben Demonstranti to see if he could recognize the stranger he had seen on November 11th. Ben stood in front of the house when a car pulled up, and out stepped the police officers, Chris's brothers, and Michael Koblin. Ben immediately recognized the man. The man apparently recognized him too. Their eyes locked, and Ben felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unsettling in the stranger's gaze, something that promised nothing good. Ben turned to the detectives and said, "I've seen this man before." It was Michael Koblin. The police invited Michael to the station and asked him if he had been on Chris's boat on November 11th. He denied it, stating that he was not even in the state, he had been in New Jersey. His wife, Regina, Jeanette's sister, confirmed his alibi. All the family members, including Chris's brothers, were also shocked that the police had suspected Michael. Chris and Michael were not just relatives, but close friends and business partners. The 2 men owned a transportation company together. Chris had invested nearly all his money into the company and owned 49%, while Michael held the remaining 51%. As far as the family knew, Chris and Michael had a good relationship, and there had never been any conflict between them. The police had no choice but to release Michael, and he returned to New Jersey. Ben Demonstranti couldn't believe it. He had seen Michael with his own eyes. Could he have made a mistake? He was restless, tormented by the thought that he had wrongly accused an innocent person. But the police weren't ready to completely rule out Michael as a suspect. They decided to dig a little deeper and see where it led. The police looked into Chris Benedetto's financial situation and discovered that he had lent Michael a substantial sum of money, $160,000. If Chris had demanded the money back from Michael, and Michael had no way to pay it back and had run out of excuses, it was possible that he might have decided to kill Chris and Jeanette. However, proving this would be incredibly difficult, especially in the case of Chris's murder, because the police had neither a body nor a crime scene. The investigators thought that if Michael had indeed been in Florida on the day of the murders, he most likely used his credit card to purchase a plane ticket. They discovered that Michael had an American Express account, and there was another person who could use his card, someone named Mike Carey. Interestingly, Mike Carey had bought a flight to Florida on November 10th and returned to New Jersey on the 12th. The investigators had to find out who this Mike Carey was. Perhaps Mike Carey resembled Michael Koblin, and Ben had simply made a mistake. However, there were 16 men named Mike Carey in the country who were of the right age. The police checked each of them, eliminating them one by one. It took months, but none of them matched the description. None knew Michael Koblin, none had been to Florida, and none owned an American Express card. While the police were still investigating the identity of Mike Carey, Chris's family filed a lawsuit against Michael Koblin's family because he had not returned the $160,000 that belonged to Chris and Jeanette. In response, Michael declared bankruptcy, which seemed to confirm that he was unable to repay the debt. Though the lawsuit would eventually be dismissed in August 2002, Chris's family likely began to believe that the police's suspicions were not unfounded. In March 1999, another shocking and inexplicable event occurred. Michael Koblin was attacked near an office complex in West Orange, New Jersey. Unknown assailants struck him in the head, leaving a skull fracture, and tore off his pants and underwear. However, the attackers did not steal his wallet or any other valuables. After the beating, Michael was in critical condition and unable to speak. The police never managed to determine who had attacked Michael or whether it was connected to the murders. It's possible that someone in the family felt the investigation was progressing too slowly, or perhaps Michael had angered someone else, or it was just a random attack. In June 1999, the police began examining the phone records of Michael Koblin and his wife Regina. It turned out that on November 11, 1998, at 2:14 p.m., someone had made a call from Florida to Regina's mobile phone. The call was made from a payphone at a hotel within walking distance of the couple's home. Detectives visited the hotel, where they found a registration card under the name of Mike Carey. Here's where it got interesting. The registration card listed the home address of Michael Koblin. A handwriting expert from the FBI confirmed that the card had been filled out by Koblin himself. This meant that Michael Carey was simply a made-up name by Michael Koblin. The police had now disproved his alibi. He had in fact been in Florida on November 11th, and both he and his wife had lied. The detectives knew that when Michael came to search for Janet and Chris a week after their disappearance, he stayed on a friend's boat. Investigators examined all incoming and outgoing calls from the boat and noticed that Michael had called a jewelry store in New York. Initially, the police didn't pay much attention to this, but then they realized that Janet's engagement ring, diamond earrings, and watch were missing. They were certain of this because in July 1998, Janet had filmed every room of her house for insurance purposes. Specifically, she filmed her jewelry. Also in Chris's safe, there was a certificate from the jewelry store. The missing jewelry was worth $58,300. The police concluded that Michael had stolen the jewelry and taken it to the jeweler to return it and get money or sell it. In May 2003, more than 4 years had passed since the investigation began. The detectives flew to New York to speak with the jeweler. He confirmed that Michael had visited the store. Michael told the jeweler that the owner of the jewelry was dead and her husband was missing. Since Michael had spent a lot of money, he took the valuables from the safe. The jeweler agreed to take the jewelry, but paid a sum lower than their real value, suspecting that something was not right. The police were certain that if they could link Michael to the missing jewelry of the murdered woman, they could arrest him. The prosecutor promised the jeweler immunity during the trial if he could get Michael to make a compromising statement. The jeweler agreed. He said Michael was supposed to come in 2 weeks to pick up a piece of jewelry for his daughter. On the scheduled day, the jeweler wore a recording device and was given instructions on how to start the conversation with the suspect. When Michael appeared in the store, the jeweler whispered to him that the FBI had visited and asked what he should say about the jewelry. Michael replied that as far as he knew, the jeweler had never seen them again. He added that if the jeweler talked, he would seriously set him up. That was enough for the police. The man was arrested and taken to the station, but, of course, he was not about to confess to anything. However, the detectives already had a good idea of what happened on that day, November 11th. Around 8 a.m., Chris and Michael went aboard Chris's boat. The vessel left the shore. Based on the fact that Michael bought a plane ticket under a fake name, it was clear that he had planned the murder in advance. Chris didn't even need to bring up the issue of the debt. His fate was already sealed. Once the boat was far from shore, Michael decided to act. He attacked Chris, possibly wounding or hitting him in the head, catching him off guard. Then Michael wrapped the anchor chain around Chris's body and threw him overboard. He knew that once the body hit the water, the heavy chain and anchor would drag it under, and the Gulf Stream would carry it out into the Atlantic Ocean. Afterward, Michael returned to Chris's house. He couldn't leave Janet alive because she knew he was in Florida and had seen the two men head out fishing together. Michael strangled Janet with the rope he had taken on the boat, shoved her into the small freezer chest head first, and hid the chest under the table so it wouldn't be noticed. Most likely, the murderer had planned to dispose of the second body a week later, but he couldn't do so because it had frozen to the side of the freezer, and Michael couldn't move it. It's very likely he had planned to throw Janet overboard just like her husband. This was a cold-blooded, premeditated murder. He had thought it all through, but his greed doomed him. Had he not been tempted by Janet's jewelry, the police would never have been able to connect him to the murders, even though they were certain of his guilt. The trial of Michael began on February 16, 2005, 7 years after the murders. His defense claimed that he had indeed visited Florida on the day of the murders, but for an affair. According to them, he had a mistress in Florida. They suggested that the couple had actually been killed by drug dealers. Furthermore, his lawyers argued that Michael had cooperated with the police and even helped pay for the funeral expenses, which they claimed proved his innocence. Interesting logic. Overall, the defense strategy seemed absurd, and it was no surprise that the jury sided with the prosecution. In May 2005, Michael Koblin was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died of a heart attack 2 years later in prison. During the trial, it was revealed that the police believed Michael had an accomplice. The name was not disclosed, but it's easy to guess that it was Regina, who lied to provide an alibi for her husband and continued to cover for him afterwards. Unfortunately, she was not held accountable for her involvement in the murders of her own sister and brother-in-law. Michael Koblin almost got away with double murder. He carefully planned his actions, let the Gulf Stream carry Chris's body into the ocean, and left no physical evidence behind. But what he didn't account for was the close-knit community of Singer Island, always ready to support their neighbors and make sure a murderer didn't escape justice. Do you have a good relationship with your neighbors? A single piece of evidence can hold the key to solving a complicated crime, if it can be found. Kim Dorsey, a beautiful woman, wife and businesswoman, is found dead. Her home is turned upside down, and evidence is scattered everywhere, none of it seemingly connected. Among the chaos, investigators hope to find the one clue that will unlock the mystery of what happened inside the house. A puzzle piece hidden in the dark that could answer why an innocent woman lost her life in her own home. Or perhaps she wasn't so innocent after all. It was around 8 a.m. on Sunday, October 28, 2012, when Derek Dorsey pulled up to his home in East Jacksonville, Florida. He had just finished a 24-hour shift as a firefighter. Since Saturday had featured a college football game, Florida versus Georgia, emergency crews had been extremely busy, and Derek was exhausted. All he wanted was to lie down next to his still sleeping wife, Kim. At the front door, he noticed something unusual. A small dog figurine placed there in memory of Kim's late pet had been knocked over, but Derek was too tired to give it much thought. He walked straight into the bedroom, which was dark thanks to blackout curtains. He expected to see his wife in bed, but instead, she was lying on the floor, naked, face down. At first, Derek thought she had tripped and hit her head, or maybe had too much to drink the night before. But then he saw the blood, a lot of it. His emergency responder instincts kicked in. In the darkness of the bedroom, he began performing first aid and called 911. His fellow firefighters quickly responded, sirens blaring, heading straight for his house, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. Derek desperately tried to revive Kim, but at last he had to face the truth. Her body had already grown cold. It was too late for Kim. After years of saving others, he hadn't been able to save his own wife. With resignation in his voice, Derek told the dispatcher, "My wife is dead. She cut herself with a knife." I think she did something to herself. Kind, cheerful, independent, and incredibly smart, Kim was an extraordinary person. It's no wonder Derek fell head over heels for her the moment they met. By their second date, he already knew he wanted to marry her. But Kim, who was studying to become an engineer at the time, wasn't in a hurry. 7 years passed before Derek finally mustered the courage to ask the big question, and Kim simply stood up and walked away. Derek was sure he had ruined everything. But then Kim returned and pulled a small, elongated box out of her purse. Inside was a bracelet engraved with the word yes. They got married a year later and dove headfirst into their careers. Now, Derek worked as a firefighter and also ran a small construction business. Kim completed her studies and began training and preparing building inspectors. Within just 2 weeks, she was asked to lead the entire department. They didn't have children yet. Both were focused on building successful careers. Besides, their jobs took up most of their time, but they shared their home with 3 dogs. Despite their busy schedules, the couple would take the dogs to the park every weekend and went on long walks with them every day. However, the workload began to take its toll. It became increasingly difficult for Kim to switch off and relax. She sought help from a specialist for depression. He prescribed her medication, and it worked. She became her old self again, cheerful and spontaneous. But the relief didn't last long. The medication came with side effects that caused a lot of problems. Kim lost sleep, began gaining weight, and was constantly tired and irritable. She felt trapped in a vicious cycle and feared that abruptly stopping the medication would plunge her into an even deeper depression. She planned to discuss it with her doctor, but never got the chance. That's why Derek assumed she had tried to quit the medication all at once, which led to such a tragic outcome. Meanwhile, detectives arrived at the Dorsey home. They had been informed that the victim had inflicted the injuries on herself. Their task was to confirm this in person, and they expected it wouldn't take long. But what they found in the house was chaos. From the look of the bedroom, something terrible had happened there. A revolver with a pink handle, a knife, and a broken pool cue were lying on the floor. Blood spatter was visible on various walls, but most of the blood had soaked into the carpet. The victim's body was not only covered in blood, but also bruised. There was no way Kim could have inflicted such injuries on herself. The rest of the house, especially the kitchen, told the detectives even more. Cabinets were left wide open. Cigarette butts were scattered across the kitchen floor, even though Kim didn't smoke and didn't allow smoking in her home. And it was highly unlikely she would let someone throw cigarette butts on the floor. The butts were sent off for DNA analysis. There were also bullet holes in the ceiling. But the most surprising and baffling detail was that the remotes for the family's entertainment system were found in the kitchen sink, along with Kim's mobile phone. Overall, everything in the house screamed that Kim had fallen victim to a brutal attack. What the detectives saw clearly contradicted the statement Derek Dorsey had made to the emergency operator. How could he think his wife had harmed herself after seeing the scene? That was just one of the many questions investigators wanted to ask the man. So, still wearing his firefighter uniform, he was taken to the station. He explained that he hadn't been home for 24 hours because he was working. He had called his wife several times on Saturday, and she hadn't answered, though he added this wasn't unusual enough for him to start worrying. Derek spoke about Kim's struggle with depression and then with the side effects of the medications. From the detective's questions, Derek guessed that his wife had been murdered, that she hadn't done it to herself. He asked the detective directly, and the detective confirmed his suspicion. The bedroom was dark when he got home, and that may have caused him to misjudge the situation. Because of this, and without fully realizing what had happened, Derek, a trained firefighter, broke one of the cardinal rules of a crime scene: do not touch anything. He covered his wife's body with a blanket to shield her nudity. But he did this after his colleagues had arrived, and they saw him do it. Derek was very open during the conversation. He admitted that he and his wife had grown apart physically and hadn't been intimate for several weeks. When the investigator asked directly if either of them had been involved in an affair, Derek, without hesitation, confessed to being unfaithful. The only thing left to determine was whether his affair could have been a motive for Kim's murder. Derek's alibi checked out. He was at work. Surveillance cameras at the residential complex confirmed that he had left that morning. There were also the missed calls on Kim's phone, just as he'd said. But even so, the detectives were not yet ready to rule out the husband as a suspect. The detectives got to work. They immediately noticed that the entrance to the residential complex where Kim and Derek lived had gates. However, it turned out that the gates had been left open on Saturday because one of the residents needed them to stay that way. This meant that Kim could have been attacked by a stranger who happened to be near her home and targeted the family's valuables. But the more the police examined the house, the more they realized that this wasn't a random attack. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant either Kim had opened the door for her killer or he had let himself in. Moreover, a burglar wouldn't have left empty-handed. Kim's Hummer was parked in the driveway. Valuable items and computers were clearly visible inside the house, and there was a Rolex watch near the bed. But nothing shouted "not a random crime" louder than Kim's body. She had been brutally beaten, at some point bound with zip ties, and likely sexually assaulted. The killer must have been full of rage toward the victim to do something like that to her. The officers questioned the Dorsey family's neighbors. One of them recalled that on Saturday, there had been a small SUV parked in front of the family's house. However, it didn't raise any suspicion at the time. The neighbor hadn't seen the driver. The autopsy revealed that Kim died on Saturday morning, shortly after her husband left for work. Her phone, which had been damaged after being thrown into the kitchen sink, stopped working around the same time. According to the crime scene analysis, Kim had just gotten out of bed when her killer entered the bedroom. She was likely asleep and woke up to a noise. She was standing by the bedroom door when the attacker struck her in the face, breaking her nose. The pain from such a blow is excruciating. Eyes instantly fill with tears, and people usually fall to the ground. But judging by the blood spatter, the killer didn't stop there. He kept beating her again and again, so violently that she eventually lost consciousness. Kim lay on the floor for some time, as indicated by the pool of blood on her side of the bed. Then the attacker zip-tied her to the nightstand. This gave him time to leave the bedroom and search through drawers and cabinets in the kitchen. However, that short break also gave Kim time to regain consciousness, free herself, and do something incredible. She retrieved her revolver from the nightstand to which she had been tied. It's unlikely that she could see clearly after being struck in the face, but she probably heard the killer moving around in the nearby kitchen. She might have heard him coming back. Relying on sound, she fired 5 shots through the bedroom doorway. The bullets hit the kitchen ceiling, but unfortunately, none struck the attacker. Even after that, she didn't give up. Kim got up. She didn't dare run into the kitchen through the door. She dropped the now useless gun and in desperation rushed to the window on the opposite side of the bed. She pulled back the curtains, slightly opened the blinds, and was ready to climb out when the killer caught her. He viciously beat her again with a pool cue, so violently that he broke her ribs. She collapsed to the floor, but he showed no mercy. The killer stabbed her in the neck with a knife. The autopsy also indicated that the attacker most likely sexually assaulted Kim in multiple ways. Although the pathologist couldn't find clear evidence of forced intercourse, investigators doubted that anything had happened with her consent. So the autopsy and forensic findings painted for the detectives a picture of a brave but ultimately doomed struggle by Kim. But this grim scenario also revealed something important about the killer. The zip ties used to restrain Kim, the pool cue, and the knife were all items that belonged to the Dorsey household. This meant the murderer had been in the house before and knew where to find those items. First and foremost, Derek knew, but he wasn't the only one. You see, Derek and Kim Dorsey were an extremely welcoming couple. They often let not only friends but also people in need stay at their home. For instance, at different times they had taken in Lance Kirkpatrick and Joshua Veal. Derek immediately ruled Lance out. Lance was his friend, had worked for his construction company, and Derek was sure he would never harm a woman. Besides, Lance couldn't have done it. Right before Kim's death, he had landed a new job on a boat in Georgia. Joshua's situation was far more complicated. Not only was he in town, but he had also run into trouble with the law before. Joshua was a young man who had worked for Derek for a time. He didn't have much experience in construction, but Derek needed people who were willing to work, so he gave Joshua a job and later allowed him to live in their home. Joshua had stayed with the couple for several months. Overall, Derek and Kim wanted to help him get back on his feet and find a path in life. But they hadn't succeeded because the young man preferred indulging in the pleasures provided by illegal substances to working. Derek was eventually forced to ask Joshua to move out, but they parted on good terms. And when Joshua occasionally asked for work, Derek never refused him because Joshua really did great work when he showed up. However, Joshua never gave up his bad habits. He was arrested for possession of illegal substances and was released just a day before Kim's attack. And there was something else important for the investigators. On the Sunday morning, just before Derek found Kim's body, he had stopped at a gas station to meet Joshua and give him a ride to work, but the young man never showed up. The gas station camera captured only Derek. After everything the investigators had learned, They were eager to speak with Joshua. However, he wasn't hiding. He tried contacting Derek again. The men agreed to meet at a local diner, but there the detectives were already waiting for him. They took him to the station for questioning. The officers began questioning Joshua cautiously, trying not to give away that they were investigating Kim's murder. The young man explained that he had spent the weekend with friends and had missed his meeting with Derek because he had slept through it. Slowly, the detectives steered the conversation toward the main topic, Kim. They wanted the 21-year-old to explain his relationship with the 38-year-old victim. Joshua admitted that he was very fond of her. There had been no romantic relationship between them, but Joshua admired her beauty, as well as her kindness and generosity. When the detectives finally told him that Kim had been murdered, the young man was in disbelief. He had just spoken with Derek half an hour earlier, and Derek hadn't mentioned anything about it. Joshua was genuinely upset and broke down in tears, as if he had been told that someone very close to him had died. His emotional reaction seemed so sincere that one of the detectives couldn't help but try to comfort him. Joshua's alibi checked out. He hadn't been anywhere near the Dorsey residence on Saturday. His name was removed from the list of suspects. Derek's alibi was also very solid. The detectives were still unsure about what to think of him. They knew he had been an unfaithful husband, which gave him a possible motive. But if he had hired someone to kill Kim, why was he acting so openly and trying so hard to help? He called every day, wanted to know how the investigation was progressing, and tried to be useful. When the crime scene investigators were done, he agreed to walk through the entire house with the detectives, commenting on anything that seemed strange to him. Perhaps he would notice something the investigators hadn't caught. One of the things they asked him to do was turn on the media center. Not that they had a specific reason for the request, but the remote controls in the sink were bothering them. Derek switched on the TV and flipped to the DVD menu, where adult content appeared on the screen. Derek was overwhelmed with emotion. He immediately said that the disc wasn't his, and Kim would definitely never watch something like that. "The killer must have done this," he said. And then Derek remembered something important. The specialist who had set up the complex TV system in their house was there the day before Kim's murder. In fact, the system was so complicated that it required using 5 remotes to watch anything. Kim and Derek had called the technician to simplify it and make it possible to operate with just one remote. This meant that he was another person who had been in the house and knew the layout of the rooms. His name was JR. Derek knew him through work and had no reason to suspect him. But who else could it be? What if he had come back to steal the expensive system that he had just installed? The detectives paid a visit to the technician. JR hadn't heard about Kim's death yet and initially thought the detectives were inquiring about Derek. He didn't deny being in the Dorsey house recently and noticed some tension between the couple. While he was setting up the TV, Kim mentioned she was going to the gym, but Derek didn't respond. The lack of reaction from the husband struck JR as odd. When he himself was informed about Kim's death, he seemed too calm, too composed. But strangely, he expected others to react more emotionally. However, it wasn't just his behavior that caught the attention of the police. As is often the case, the victim had fought for her life. But could JR have made a move on the beautiful Kim, not noticing the lack of affection between the husband and wife? The detectives wanted to know the answer to that question, but JR said he had cut his hand at work. They asked for a DNA sample, and he agreed. Only after the detectives left did it dawn on him that they weren't interested in him as a witness, but as a suspect. He initially thought Derek was guilty, as Derek seemed to be a rather hot-headed person. In any case, JR's alibi checked out. The police had now eliminated 2 suspects from their list, but they didn't believe they had hit a dead end. There was so much information in the case that they felt it would be solved soon. The flow of information was only increasing. A police report arrived at the sheriff's office containing a small detail that turned the case upside down. It was a report related to a completely different car theft case, and it might have gone unnoticed if not for an attentive officer who spotted the name of the potential car thief. The woman reported that she had been at a party at a friend's house, and one of her acquaintances asked to borrow the car for a short time but never returned. This happened on Saturday night, just hours before Kim's murder. The woman's acquaintance was named Lance Kirkpatrick. He was the very same friend of Derek's, who had lived in his house and, according to Derek, wouldn't have lifted a finger against his wife. The police hadn't been looking for the man because he was supposedly working on a boat at sea, but this report cast doubt on that statement. The police recalled the neighbor's statement who had seen a small SUV near the Dorsey family's house. The description of the SUV matched that of the stolen vehicle. The detectives checked the surveillance footage, and indeed, around the time of the crime, the stolen SUV passed through the gates of the residential complex where the victim lived. However, the driver was not captured on video. The investigators were becoming more eager to speak with Lance Kirkpatrick. However, they didn't know where he was. What if he really was on the boat out at sea, and the woman was lying about him? The police were skeptical of her statement because she was known for her addiction to illegal substances. In fact, in circles like hers, it wasn't uncommon for someone to trade a car for drugs, so she might have given the car to someone else. However, the investigators had no way of contacting the boat where Lance supposedly worked. Lance's family didn't communicate with him much and didn't know where he was either. At that point, the detectives invited Brian Kiefer to the station. It was at Brian's house where the party had been held when the guest's SUV was stolen. Brian confirmed that he had invited friends over to his house, and Lance Kirkpatrick had indeed been there. Brian told them that Lance had taken someone's SUV to go buy illegal substances but never came back. However, on Sunday, Lance called him, asking to meet at a gas station. When they met, Brian immediately noticed that Lance had a wound on one of his hands. Brian was completely unprepared for what Lance was about to say. Lance blurted out that he had committed the murder and was going to prison, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Brian didn't understand what he was talking about, but Lance went on to explain that on Saturday morning, he had entered the house of his boss, Derek Dorsey. There, he ran into Kim. Upon seeing him, the girl grabbed for her phone and Lance panicked. He took the phone from her and told her to get out of the way because he just needed his things. But the confrontation quickly escalated. Lance told Brian that he beat the girl with a pool cue, and she fired 5 shots at him from a revolver. He even mentioned the last words she said. As she was dying, she uttered, "Stop, you're killing me." Lance's story was so horrifying that Brian didn't believe him. However, the police were listening to Brian with keen interest. They thought that Brian had just described the murder of Kim, mentioning details only the killer could know, like the remotes in the sink. The problem was, Brian himself could have been the murderer. He also had access to the SUV, and although he was now running a building repair business, he had a criminal past. Still, it wasn't clear what his motive could have been or why he would have broken into the Dorsey home and waited for the moment when the gates to the complex were open. Now the detectives had to find Lance and hear his side of the story. Fortunately, Brian knew where to find him. Lance was brought to the station. He explained that he had borrowed money from Derek Dorsey for a trip to the sea, where a job awaited him. After that, he came to Jacksonville for just one day, on Saturday, October 27th. He wanted to see Derek and drove to his house. He knocked on the door, but no one answered, so he left. In other words, he had just admitted that he was at the house of the murdered woman on the very Saturday, October 27th, when the crime occurred. The detective asked if he had entered the house. Lance responded no, especially since the key wasn't in its usual place. Wait a minute, what key? Lance had just slipped up and mentioned something the investigators had suspected from the beginning. The spare key was under a dog statue by the entrance to the house. Suddenly, the tipped-over statue made sense. Lance must have moved it to get the key. He knew it would be there as he had once lived in the house and had surely used it before. All the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Lance was arrested on charges of murdering Kim Dorsey. However, the investigators still didn't have an answer to the question that had been troubling them from the beginning. Was Derek involved in his wife's murder? Could he have enlisted his friend's help to get rid of Kim? Perhaps her life was insured, and Derek planned to profit from it. The police examined his gadgets and bank accounts, but found nothing that could link him to the murder. No messages or transactions between Derek and Lance concerning the murder. No funds transferred to Lance's account. In fact, without his wife's financial contribution to the family budget, Derek's situation had only worsened. It was clear he had no interest in her death. He was finally cleared of suspicion and informed about Lance's arrest. Derek didn't immediately grasp what was being said. He thought Lance might have been involved in a traffic incident or something similar, but when they explained everything to him, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that Lance had killed his wife, the woman who had always treated him like a friend, who had allowed him to live in her home. Lance Kirkpatrick did not plead guilty to breaking into the house, assaulting, or murdering Kim. However, there was plenty of evidence against him. In addition to the testimony of Brian Kiefer and the surveillance footage showing the stolen SUV, forensic experts found Lance's DNA on Kim's body, on a cigarette butt, and on the pool cue he used to beat her. Knowing this, Lance changed his story by the time the trial began. He admitted to delivering the fatal blows to Kim, but he claimed it was in self-defense. Here's what he told investigators. He had come to the family home to retrieve a sweater with Georgia written on it that he had left behind. Kim opened the door and let him in. Lance explained that it was his adult film that the investigators had found in the DVD player. The disc had come free with an adult magazine bought at a nearby gas station. He began watching the film. Kim wasn't interested in such films, but became curious about Lance. They went to the bedroom and engaged in intimate activities, after which Kim's mood changed drastically. Lance believed this change was due to a strong medication she had been taking. They argued. Kim grabbed a revolver from the nightstand and started shooting. When the revolver ran out of bullets, Lance grabbed the pool cue and began swinging it indiscriminately. The blow knocked Kim unconscious. At first, he tied her up with zip ties and planned to wait for the police, but then changed his mind. He went to the kitchen for scissors, but couldn't find them, so he took a knife, intending to cut the zip ties with it. However, he couldn't do this without cutting Kim in the process. He went back to the kitchen, and when he returned, Kim had freed herself and was standing with the knife. They began fighting again, and before Lance realized what happened, the knife was on the floor, and so was Kim, dead. He waited for the police for some time, but when they didn't arrive, he left because he was scared. His version of events was somewhat supported by the fact that the coroner could not determine whether Kim had been sexually assaulted. But there were several inconsistencies in his story. When Kim started shooting, based on the trajectory of the bullets, she was lying on the floor. Why would she have laid down during the argument just to then pull out the revolver from the nightstand? Even if we assume that part of the story was true, why did he grab the cue and begin hitting her with such force that he broke her ribs? After she emptied the revolver's cylinder, why didn't he just turn around and run out of the house? Why engage in a struggle with a girl who, by his own admission, was in an impaired state? The jury didn't believe Lance. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. He will serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Derek Dorsey believes Lance got off too easily. It was extremely difficult for Derek to start his life over after the death of his wife. He left the fire department and found solace in his late wife's beloved pets. Every time he looks at the dogs, he remembers Kim, how she always tried to help others. Unfortunately for Kim, help came too late.
When the body of a teenage girl was found murdered, the tiny town of Wausau in Wisconsin was gripped by fear. Everyone worried they might be the next victim of the ruthless intruder. But if the motive was money, why didn't he take it? The stories of the suspects only puzzled the detectives further. They wondered, was this merely a show to conceal what was really happening behind closed doors? Or was it genuine grief over the loss of a loved one? Until they found a startling clue that could put the final nail in the killer's coffin. Saturday, May 2nd, 2009, began like any other day for the emergency services in the quiet town of Wausau, Wisconsin. Although it was expected to be an uneventful day, a call came in at 1:30 p.m. A woman reported that her neighbor had asked her to call an ambulance for his brother's girlfriend. She was lying on the floor of their apartment with a throat wound and cuts all over her body. The police officers dispatched to the scene hoped the woman was mistaken, as the situation often turns out to be less severe than the caller describes. But not this time. Several people were waiting for the officers in the parking lot of the apartment complex. One of them stepped forward and led them to the apartment. It was 19-year-old Hugo Ramirez. The young man could barely form sentences due to how much he was crying and shaking. Hugo was about to show the detectives what had shocked him so much. The officers would not soon forget this scene either. Entering the apartment, they walked through an unremarkable living room and kitchen and approached a small hallway. Hugo pointed to the bedroom at the very end on the left. Even before stepping into the room, the officers were stunned by the sight that met their eyes. The drying blood was everywhere, on the carpet, on the belongings, and of course, on the girl lying in the center of this bloody scene. Hugo informed them that the girl's name was Brianna Schneller. Brianna lay on her back, her mutilated face covered with a towel. There were deep wounds on her neck and across the upper part of her torso. Cuts on her arms indicated that she had fought for her life, but the killer had overpowered her. Now the police needed to hurry. Journalists were already surrounding the crime scene, and it was crucial that Brianna's loved ones did not learn of her death from the news. By the time the officers contacted the Schneller family, they already knew something had happened at the apartment where the girl lived and that someone had died. but they didn't know that Brianna was the victim. Her parents had been trying to reach her without success. They were informed of the news at the station. Afterward, they were asked to identify Brianna from photographs taken at the crime scene. Even after confirming it was her parents, Craig and Lori, and her brother Rocky, still couldn't believe what had happened. Despite their unspeakable sorrow, the family members tried to provide the police with as much information as possible about Brianna and the details of her life leading up to the murder. Craig and Lori explained that Brianna's life was much like that of her peers. She was finishing school, working part-time as a waitress in a restaurant, and enjoyed spending her free time with friends. She loved shopping, dancing, and music. Moreover, Brianna was looking forward to a trip to Tennessee that summer, where she was to present an important project for a renowned non-profit national organization of professional and technical student leaders. Brianna was the only person in the entire state of Wisconsin who met all the criteria to participate in this event. To the family, what had happened made no sense. As Craig explained, she didn't have a single enemy. Her relationship with her boyfriend, 22-year-old Sebastian Ramirez, Hugo's brother, was wonderful. The couple had met a couple of years ago and had been inseparable since. During this time, the parents had gotten to know the young man well. Naturally, they had concerns when Brianna decided to move in with him at 18. They worried that she was growing up too fast. But Sebastian truly loved their daughter, so they accepted her decision. After high school, she planned to pursue higher education in restaurant management and dreamed of opening a restaurant with Sebastian. She genuinely enjoyed working in the restaurant business, and she was loved by her colleagues and customers. The girl's parents also helped the police narrow down the time frame of the attack on Brianna. Her mother, Lori, was the last person to speak with Brianna a few hours before the body was discovered. That day, Lori had taken her daughter's car to the auto shop to fix the brakes and had texted her daughter at 10 a.m. Thus, the attack occurred sometime after Lori spoke with her daughter at 10 a.m. and before Hugo found her at 1:30 p.m. While the detectives were speaking with the girl's parents, forensic experts found several clues at the crime scene. First of all, an iron lying on the floor near Brianna caught their attention. Various parts of it were scattered on the floor, and there was blood on the iron, suggesting the killer might have used it as a weapon. In the bathroom sink were 2 knives, one of which was missing its sharp tip. Blood was found on a bar of soap nearby, indicating that the killer had taken the time to wash the knives and their hands, but had missed leaving a bloody shoe print on the mat. Further examination of the apartment revealed 2 more interesting points. First, there were no signs of forced entry, and second, nothing seemed to be missing. This was especially curious because cash was scattered throughout the apartment. Various bills ranging from $1 to $20 added up to a considerable sum. If a robber had broken in for money, they would have taken it. Thus, the evidence at the crime scene indicated that Brianna herself was the target of the attack. The autopsy confirmed this conclusion. The most crucial information the medical examiner shared with the detectives was that the girl had fought for her life, and the killer's DNA likely remained under her nails. Skin samples found under her nails were sent for analysis. Overall, the autopsy confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality and the attacker's fury. Brianna had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely the iron found near her body. The attacker also slashed her throat with a knife and inflicted so many stab wounds that the pathologist couldn't accurately count them. The knife wounds were particularly severe, and at least 2 of them were fatal enough to kill her within a minute. The tip of one of the knives found in the sink was discovered in one of her wounds. Usually, such a savage attack indicates that the killer must have felt uncontrollable rage towards the victim to inflict so many injuries. But who could have harbored such strong feelings toward Brianna? The police knew of at least one person they needed to speak with immediately. Sebastian was brought to the station along with his brother, but they were placed in separate interrogation rooms so their statements could be compared later. Sebastian explained that he woke up around 9:15 a.m., an hour before he was due at the Mexican restaurant where he and his brother worked. The restaurant, El Tequila Salsa, was about 3 kilometers from the apartment, a 10-minute drive. The young man took a shower and chatted with Brianna, as she didn't need to go to school on Saturdays. Hugo had overslept, so his brother had to wake him up just before leaving the house at 10 a.m. By 10:15 a.m., Sebastian was already at work and was there when he received the call informing him about what had happened to his girlfriend. Hugo's story began much like his brother's version. After being woken up by his brother, he quickly got ready and left the house 15 minutes after Sebastian. Nothing unusual happened at work. At 1:20 p.m., Hugo went on a break and drove home to take a short nap. Entering the apartment, he initially didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He walked down the hallway and into his room, but he soon felt uncomfortable, as if something was wrong. That's when he noticed that Sebastian's room door was open. Hugo peeked inside and, to his horror, saw Brianna lying on the floor. Rushing over, Hugo started shouting her name, begging her to get up, to wake up, but she didn't respond. Only then did he notice how much blood there was in the room. He tried to dial 911, but his mind suddenly stopped working and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even press the buttons. He then ran downstairs, where through his panic he tried to explain to a neighbor that they needed to call for help. The young men seemed genuinely devastated by what had happened. Investigators wanted to believe them, but they knew they needed evidence to confirm their innocence. It was possible they were simply excellent actors, or were hiding remorse beneath a mask of grief and pain. Since both brothers' stories were identical, detectives considered the possibility that one of them committed the crime and the other was covering for him. In such a scenario, Sebastian seemed to have a potential motive to kill Brianna. Officers questioned the brothers about their relationship with Brianna, whether there were any issues, quarrels, or jealousy. Sebastian categorically denied any problems and stuck to his story. Brianna was the love of his life, and they were looking forward to a happy future together. Hugo was questioned with even greater scrutiny, especially after it was revealed he was supposed to work until 3 p.m. that day, but had changed his break time with a colleague due to a hangover, wanting to go home and rest. Detectives wanted to know if anything had happened between him and Brianna. Were there arguments? Perhaps Hugo also had romantic feelings for her, but Sebastian proved to be a more successful rival. However, Hugo vehemently denied this. Brianna was like a sister to him. He knew how deeply she and Sebastian loved each other, and he would never stand in their way. These interrogations continued for hours, but no matter what the police asked, Hugo and Sebastian stood by their stories. However, the brothers were able to clarify the issue of the scattered money found throughout the apartment. It was Hugo's tips. Previously, he used to carefully count all the money, but lately he had become lazy. When he came home, he simply emptied his pockets wherever, always promising himself to deal with it later. After obtaining DNA samples from the brothers, they were released, but in the eyes of the detectives, they remained the only suspects in Brianna's murder. Therefore, their next task was to either confirm or disprove the brothers' testimonies. Colleagues from the Mexican restaurant El Tequila Salsa confirmed that the young men were at work. Moreover, the restaurant had surveillance cameras, including ones that recorded the kitchen area. After reviewing the footage, the police confirmed that Sebastian arrived at work first at 10:13 a.m. and did not leave until after Brianna's body was discovered. Hugo arrived at work a few minutes later and took his break at 1:20 p.m., just as he had stated. At the same time, the detectives were following another lead. Their conclusion that nothing had been stolen from the apartment had been hasty. Although the money and valuables were indeed left behind, the police had not found Brianna's phone. Like any teenage girl, Brianna always kept her phone with her. Moreover, she had exchanged messages with her mother at 10 a.m., so she definitely had it with her before the murder. This greatly interested the police, as the phone could contain something crucial to solving her murder. Therefore, the detectives made finding the phone their priority. They contacted Brianna's service provider. The phone company pinged the device and not only found that it was on, but also pinpointed its exact location. The detectives took one look at the address and were stunned. They knew this place. More than that, they had just been there. The phone was located near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, where the brothers Sebastian and Hugo worked. The detectives rushed to the location to find and seize the device as quickly as possible. Upon arrival, they realized that the coordinates were not for the restaurant itself, but for the parking lot of the shopping center where the restaurant was located. The police soon narrowed down the search area to the section where the dumpsters were. The detectives were reluctant to sift through all the garbage bags and had a simple yet brilliant idea. They called the phone, opening the dumpsters one by one. Finally, they heard the ringtone. Carefully moving the contents of the dumpster, the officers saw a light-colored bag through which the phone's screen light was visible. The bag contained several items, not just the phone. The police were eager to open it, but had to send it to the lab first because it could have DNA on it, especially on the top where someone had carefully twisted it closed. However, the detectives could already make one conclusion. This was not an ordinary bag, but a bag with the logo of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, which customers used for takeout orders. The circle around the brothers was tightening more and more. Of course, they seemed to have an alibi, but the investigators couldn't believe that anyone else had committed the murder. Moreover, the pathologist couldn't determine the exact time of the girl's death to the minute. What if the crime happened a little earlier than they assumed? The girl had communicated with her mother at 10 a.m. Immediately after that, one of the brothers, or even both, killed Brianna, quickly got ready, and showed up at work at 10:15 a.m. Then they threw the bag with the evidence into the trash bin near the restaurant, hoping no one would find it. After the forensic experts collected DNA samples from the bag, it could finally be opened. Inside, in addition to Brianna's phone, there were warm gloves, but from different pairs, with one of them stained with blood, and also women's underwear, 2 pairs of panties. The investigators had expected anything, but not this. They had more questions than answers. According to Sebastian, the underwear belonged to Brianna. One of the gloves likely had been taken from the apartment as well. However, these items contradicted all the theories the detectives had been considering. If Hugo or Sebastian had committed the crime, it would be absurd for them to take the girl's underwear. But Sebastian and Hugo did not kill the girl. After examining Brianna's phone, investigators saw that her last conversation was not with her mother, but with a friend. Brianna sent her last message at 10:23, when the brothers had already definitely arrived at the restaurant, as confirmed by surveillance cameras. The entire investigation turned upside down. The police had never considered any other suspects besides the Ramirez brothers, but it turned out that both were completely innocent. So, who was the killer? And why did they dispose of the bag with evidence right near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant? Now, the detectives had to add a multitude of names to their list of suspects, employees and patrons of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant. They considered it highly unlikely that someone unrelated to the restaurant killed Brianna, collected incriminating evidence, and disposed of it right near the restaurant. Therefore, they first reviewed the list of employees, and one name caught their attention: Luciano Sanchez Ramos. The young man worked as a dishwasher at the restaurant and lived in the same building as Brianna. But most importantly, he was home on the morning of the murder. He arrived at work half an hour after Brianna sent her last message to her friend. When the police brought him in for questioning, he did not show much willingness to talk. Perhaps this was due to his immigration status or just a general distrust of the police. Nevertheless, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The detective asked if anyone could verify his alibi, even partially. Luciano said there was someone, his colleague, the restaurant's cook Raul, who gave him a ride to work. The police spoke with Raul, who confirmed that he picked up Luciano. Raul honked his horn, and within a couple of minutes, Luciano came out of the house, behaving as usual. The investigators wanted some reliable confirmation of this and hoped that surveillance cameras might reveal what Luciano did that morning. Did he really just go to work at 11 a.m., or did he stop by the dumpster to dispose of the evidence? Unfortunately, all the restaurant's cameras filmed only inside the establishment. However, there was a gas station across from the dumpsters that had its own surveillance cameras. The quality of the footage left much to be desired, and the dumpsters were far from the gas station. Still, these videos provided invaluable help to the investigation. On May 9th, the police finally finished reviewing all the footage from the restaurant and the parking lot where the dumpsters were located. Individually, these videos were not very useful, but when the detectives correlated the timestamps, they obtained a much clearer picture of what had happened. At 1:16 p.m., one person exited through the restaurant's back door. Simultaneously, only one person approached the dumpster. It was 22-year-old restaurant cook Raul Ponce Rocha. He threw away the trash, quickly returned to the restaurant kitchen, and washed his hands. What was even more interesting was that Raul was the only one who left the restaurant during the time frame when Brianna's murder was committed. At 10:21 a.m., just a few minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived at work, he exited through the back door to go pick up Luciano and returned at 10:56 a.m. Notably, he left wearing a brown hoodie but returned without it. He confirmed that he and Luciano did not make any stops on their way back to work. The detectives asked him why he was gone for 35 minutes when the trip to pick up Luciano should have taken a maximum of 20 minutes. Where did the extra 15 minutes go? Raul was surprisingly stubborn and did not attempt to explain. The detective then asked about the cuts on his hands. Raul explained that as a cook, he frequently handled knives and had cut himself about 3 weeks ago, although the cuts looked fresh. While the investigators were confident that they had the right suspect, one question continued to trouble them. Why did Raul attack Brianna, and with such brutality? After all, he barely knew her. The Ramirez brothers had always treated him well, considering him a jovial fellow who often told funny stories and never had any quarrels with them. But detectives soon found the answer to this question. The police had enough evidence to obtain a DNA sample from Raul and a search warrant for the house where he lived with his parents and brothers. To prevent him from fleeing, they detained him based on his illegal immigration status. During the search of his bedroom, police found a glove that matched the one found in the dumpster, a sweatshirt with strands of hair that could belong to Brianna, and, finally, under the mattress, several adult videos and 4 pairs of women's panties. Everything fell into place when officers remembered Brianna's mother Lori's words about how she had taken her daughter's car to the auto repair shop that day. On the morning of May 2, 2009, Raul arrived at the restaurant around 9 a.m. On his way, he passed by the house where the girl lived and noticed that her car was not in its usual spot. He made a fatal mistake, assuming she wasn't home. Knowing that Hugo and Sebastian would soon arrive for work, he decided it was a perfect opportunity to add to his modest collection and steal something from Brianna's belongings. Just minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived for work, Raul left, got into his car, and under the pretext of picking up Luciano, headed to the girl's house. He didn't immediately signal Luciano and instead went into the apartment where the brothers and Brianna lived. The lock on the apartment door was not very secure and could easily be opened with a plastic card. He entered the apartment. If the girl had caught him in the act, Raul could have claimed he was looking for the brothers and that the door was open, but most likely, the girl caught him stealing her underwear. Realizing she could identify him, Raul panicked, first hitting her with an iron and then slashing her throat with a knife, inflicting several other wounds. Detectives speculate that he began to derive pleasure from the process. Otherwise, it's unclear why he would strike her multiple times with 2 knives. After the murder, he quickly tried to clean up and took the evidence with him, as he still needed to pick up Luciano. He then returned to work as if nothing had happened and disposed of the evidence packet. All doubts about Raul's involvement disappeared when the lab results arrived. His DNA was found on the knife, the packet, the gloves, the iron, and under Brianna's fingernails. The hair on his sweatshirt also belonged to the victim. Furthermore, a blood-stained shoe print in the bathroom matched the size and pattern of Raul's shoes that he wore on the day of the murder. Raul was charged with Brianna's murder. The trial began in 2011. Initially, during interrogations, Raul claimed he had never spoken to Brianna and never entered the house where she lived. However, by the start of the trial, his story changed. Despite almost pinning the murder on Sebastian and Hugo, Raul showed no remorse and decided to accuse an innocent third person of the crime. He claimed that he had entered the apartment but left, leaving behind his colleague Sergio Juarez Gutierrez, who Brianna was discussing something with in another room. This statement could have planted doubts in the minds of the jurors because Sergio hastily left for Mexico, and Raul's lawyers were confident they wouldn't be able to question him. However, the police managed to contact Sergio in Mexico, and he was not pleased to hear that his name had been dragged through the mud. He returned for the trial and proved that he was nowhere near Brianna on the day of the murder. Sergio had returned to Mexico shortly before the murder to take care of his father, who had cancer. No one expected Sergio to appear in court, and it was a serious blow to the defendant's defense. It took the jurors only 90 minutes to find Raul guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Thus, a young woman lost her life due to a tragic mistake. Raul did not enter the apartment with the intention of killing her. But why did he choose murder instead of being charged with unlawful entry? Was he afraid of being deported? That everyone would find out about his collection? Or did he simply not realize the consequences of his actions? Did he cover Brianna's face with a towel, unable to face what he had done? Brianna's father admitted that he wanted to talk to Raul, perhaps to ask him all these questions. However, Raul declined his offer to meet. He never took responsibility for the crime. His decision was based solely on the assumption that Brianna wasn't home. After the trial, Lori Schneller said that the verdict wouldn't bring back her daughter, but would allow them to live on. "We are glad that justice was served for her," she said. I don't know if there will ever be a day like before, but it has become a little easier after the verdict. Cape May, New Jersey is the oldest seaside resort in America. It is known for its Victorian-style homes, pristine beaches, and safe spots for pleasant sea excursions. The best fishing spots are another advantage of Cape May. On October 8, 2003, a couple was enjoying a day of fishing on a boat when they spotted something in the water that they initially thought was trash floating on the surface. However, as they got closer, they realized it was a human body. The Coast Guard responded to the report of the grim discovery. They carefully retrieved the body from the water. Decomposition had already set in, but it was immediately clear that the body belonged to a woman. It didn't take a genius to understand that the woman had been murdered. Her legs were bound with heavy chains, and tape was wrapped around her wrists and ankles. A stone crab, which lives and feeds on the ocean floor, was clinging to her hip. This detail was important, as it indicated that the body had at some point sunk to the bottom of the ocean. In other words, someone had tried to dispose of the body but didn't account for the fact that, without additional weight, gases would eventually cause it to resurface, and fairly quickly. That's exactly what happened in this case. The victim had been in the water for just over a week. The woman was clothed but had no identification on her, so the New Jersey police who arrived at the scene couldn't immediately determine her identity. Another simple and obvious way to identify the victim is by checking fingerprints against national databases. Of course, after spending an extended period in cool water, the skin on her fingers had wrinkled. However, by injecting a saline solution under the skin, the forensic expert was able to restore the fingerprints to a usable state. The victim was identified as 16-year-old Kimberly Holton, a runaway from a foster family in Dover, Delaware. Now, the task was to figure out what happened between her disappearance in Delaware and how she ended up off the coast of Cape May. Kimberly, known to her friends and family as Kim or Kimmy, was born on November 4, 1986 in Delaware. At the time of her birth, her mother was struggling with substance abuse and her father was in prison. Kimberly never stayed long in one home, constantly being passed from one family member to another. Despite this instability, her character remained unaffected. The 16-year-old Kimberly was a sweet, kind, and caring young girl, always friendly and compassionate. She would occasionally share stories of her early childhood with her best friend Destiny, but her cheerful nature helped her to not dwell on the past, serving as her way to shield herself from those memories. Kimberly had a deep love for animals and always tried to help them, as no one had been there to help her when she needed it most. If given the opportunity, Kimberly likely would have become a veterinarian. Her teachers saw her as a wonderfully talented child who deserved a better start in life than the hardships she had endured. Her mother had failed to provide even the basics, like food, let alone toys. Kimberly's first foster mother adored her. They lived together for 3 years and were planning to move to Tennessee together. Their bags were already packed when, out of nowhere, Kimberly's grandfather and his wife showed up at the foster mother's house. They announced that the state had transferred custody to them, and Kimberly would now be living with them. However, her grandfather was unable to provide a stable home either, and Kimberly was returned to the foster care system. This time, she was placed with Lorraine and Rudy Machette, who were already raising another teenage girl, Heather. Kimberly was living with them when, on September 30th, 2003, 8 days before her body was found in New Jersey, she missed school. Kimberly was not one to skip classes, and when she didn't get on the school bus that day, Destiny knew something was wrong. That same evening, her foster mother, Lorraine, reported the teenager missing. Now, the police faced the difficult task of informing Lorraine that her foster daughter, Kimberly, was dead, murdered. Lorraine was genuinely upset by the news, but she admitted that she hadn't searched more actively for Kimberly because the girl had disappeared before. Kimberly had run away from home for several days at a time, but had always returned. This admission hinted to the investigators that there had been underlying problems in the household even before Kimberly went missing in late September. As a result, they took Lorraine to the station for a more detailed interrogation. The detectives wanted to understand what had been happening at home and what might have driven Kimberly to run away, not just this last time, but on previous occasions as well. Lorraine stated that her husband, Rudy, whom she was now planning to divorce, had made inappropriate advances toward their foster daughter. Just 2 weeks earlier, Kimberly had gone to the police, reporting that Rudy had gotten into bed with her and did things he shouldn't have done. The court hearing for that case was scheduled to take place in just a few days. As soon as Lorraine said this, the police saw the motive for murder they had been missing. They were convinced that Rudy was behind Kimberly's death. Lorraine's opinion was shared by Kimberly's best friend, Destinée. Destinée told the detectives that some time ago, Rudy had followed them in his car while they were just walking down the street, terrifying them. It got to the point where Destinée told her parents, and they reported it to the police. Naturally, Rudy was brought in for questioning. The detectives fully expected to get a confession from the suspect. However, Rudy seemed genuinely shocked by the girl's death. Of course, he could have been a very good actor, but at the time of Kimberly's murder, he had an alibi. During the days when Kimberly went missing, he had been staying with his adult biological daughter. His alibi checked out, and the police had no choice but to release him. The investigators hoped that the autopsy might shed light on how the girl was killed, which could help them find the murderer. After all, there were hardly any injuries on her body, aside from those caused by prolonged exposure to the water. They didn't even know whether she was alive when she was thrown into the water or already dead. But what they found only deepened the mystery. The pathologist found no DNA, gunshot wounds, stab marks, or any other clues that would point to the killer or the method of murder. The only significant finding was a severe fracture at the base of her skull. However, it wasn't caused by a blow with an object, but rather from a fall from a great height, like falling from a 5-story building. The medical examiner and the investigators were baffled. If she had been thrown into the water from a boat, she would have fallen from a height of no more than 3 meters. They couldn't understand who would kill a teenage girl by pushing her out of a window from an apartment or hotel room, only to then run down, pick up the body, put it in a car, drive to a dock, and finally dump her in the ocean after wrapping her in tape and chains. It made no sense at all. The investigators were left with only one piece of evidence to work with: the chains wrapped around Kimberly's legs. They had started to rust. However, upon examining them, the forensic experts noticed that each link of the chain had a stamp. This meant the chains could potentially be traced back to a specific store, or at least a chain of stores. They were right. These particular chains were sold at Lowe's, a home improvement retail chain. Conveniently, a Lowe's store was located near the trailer park where Kimberly had lived with her foster family. Luckily, the store manager was able to pinpoint exactly when the chains were sold. They had been purchased on September 30th, 2003, the day after Kimberly disappeared. Along with the chains, the buyers had also purchased 2 cinder blocks and locks. Investigators requested the surveillance footage, and they saw 2 young men at the checkout paying for the chains and cinder blocks before leaving. Unfortunately, tracking them down wouldn't be easy. The men had paid in cash. The video footage was also somewhat blurry, with the camera positioned high up near the ceiling. However, the men weren't hiding their behavior. They were chatting casually, walking back and forth through the store, and their gestures and mannerisms were distinct enough to identify them later. So the detectives shared the video with the press. This proved to be a major breakthrough in the case, as the police station was flooded with calls. The callers mentioned various names, but one came up more often than others: Robert Brothers. More importantly, Robert himself called the police to confirm that he was one of the men in the video. They asked him to come down to the station, where the young man appeared visibly nervous and eager to explain that he had nothing to do with the crime. Robert told the detectives that he had been at the store with his friend, Jacob Jones, who had recently decided to get into fitness and planned to use the chains and cinder blocks as workout equipment. The detectives, however, still found this explanation to be too much of a coincidence. So they asked Robert if there was any connection between Jacob and Kimberly. Robert then mentioned just one name: Heather. Robert didn't personally know either of the girls, but he knew that Heather was Lorraine's daughter, meaning she was Kimberly's foster sister. Heather and Jacob had been dating since high school. The detectives let Robert go, convinced that he was telling the truth and had no further information. However, their attention quickly shifted to what Heather might have to say about all this. Heather openly admitted that, as teenage girls living together in a trailer, she and Kimberly often fought over small things, like borrowing clothes without asking and other typical sibling squabbles. Kimberly and Jacob didn't get along either, as Kimberly liked to tease him. But when Kimberly disappeared and hadn't returned for a couple of days, Heather started to genuinely worry about her sister. She wanted to talk about her concerns with Jacob, but he simply refused to discuss the matter. Heather also recognized her boyfriend in the store video and texted him asking, "You didn't do this, did you?" He never replied. However, Heather was confident that Jacob wasn't capable of murder. He wasn't that kind of person. And indeed, Jacob Jones didn't fit the profile of a typical suspect. The 20-year-old had never been in trouble with the law. In fact, he was a university student and one of the top students in his class. Additionally, he was a member of the university's Aero Club and was an experienced pilot and instructor. He was held in such high regard by the club that he had the privilege to borrow a plane at any time. During Jacob's interrogation, it was evident that the young man was frightened. He insisted that he had bought the chains and cinder blocks for workout purposes. However, he was unable to explain where the cinder blocks were currently located. When he realized he couldn't answer several questions, he requested the presence of a lawyer. The detectives were concerned that Jacob might destroy any remaining evidence if there was any, but they had no choice but to release him. Meanwhile, they continued to gather evidence against him and discovered that the last time Jacob had flown the plane was on September 30th at approximately 11:45 p.m. He returned just 2 hours later. This couldn't be a coincidence. The detectives were now convinced that Jacob had loaded the body into the plane and dropped it over the ocean. This explained the post-mortem head injury Kimberly had sustained. However, Jacob was not a very large person. He wouldn't have been able to load the heavy cinder blocks, chains, and the dead body into the plane on his own. Jacob must have had an accomplice. The evidence against Jacob was sufficient for his arrest. On October 23rd, detectives were preparing to go to his home to arrest him and bring him in. However, they received a call from Jacob's father, who reported that his son had passed away. It seemed that after the interrogation, Jacob realized that the police were closing in on the truth and that he would be arrested. Unable to bear the thought of spending the rest of his life in prison or facing execution, he had taken a weapon, gone to his room, and pulled the trigger. Before doing so, he confessed to his parents that he had murdered Kimberly Holton. When the detectives arrived, the scene at the family home was surreal. Jacob's parents could not believe that their son, who had confessed to killing the girl, was now dead himself. Jacob had given his father a very vague explanation for why he had killed Kimberly. He simply said that she had caused problems in the family and conflicts with Heather. Therefore, he decided to take matters into his own hands and fix the situation. He went to the store, bought the chains and cinder blocks with the intention of killing Kimberly. Finally, Jacob confessed to his parents, who had been with him that night. And no, it wasn't Robert Brothers who had bought the chains with Jacob. His accomplice was named Michael Kaiser. Investigators had never heard of him before. Michael was 23 years old and worked as a security guard at a local racetrack. Michael and Jacob worked for the same security company and were more like colleagues and acquaintances than close friends. The detectives wanted to speak with Michael, but were sure he would immediately start denying everything. So they devised a plan to make Michael nervous. At their request, Jacob's father called Michael on his cell phone while he was on his way to work. He told Michael that Jacob had left a note confessing to the murder and naming his accomplice, Michael. The man added that he was heading to the police station to speak with the authorities. Meanwhile, the detectives followed Michael in their car, expecting anything, that he might do something foolish or attempt to flee. But suddenly he drove straight to the police station. The young man was in a highly emotional state, but confidently stated that he wanted to speak with the detectives investigating Kimberly Holton's case. Initially, during the interrogation, he tried to insist that he knew nothing about the crime, but eventually confessed to everything. Michael explained that, at Jacob's request, on September 29th, he had picked up Kimberly. They bought drinks from a store together and then went to a motel under the pretense of discussing conflicts between Heather and Kimberly. According to Michael, while they were driving, Kimberly revealed that she and Jacob were actually in a relationship, loved each other, and Jacob had promised to help her find a new place to live. At the motel, Jacob joined them. Again, according to Michael, they talked, joked, and everything seemed fine. Kimberly had intimate relations with Jacob and then with Michael while Jacob watched. Afterward, Kimberly went to the bathroom. Michael thought the evening was going well until Jacob suddenly declared he wanted to kill Kimberly, and Michael would help him do it and dispose of the body. Michael did not want to participate but yielded because Jacob threatened to kill him too. When Kimberly came out of the bathroom, Jacob grabbed her, ordered Michael to hold her legs, and wrapped a phone cord around her neck while placing a pillow on her head and strangled her. Kimberly desperately fought back but soon went silent and stopped moving. Jacob checked her pulse. She was dead. It was just after 2 in the morning when the killers moved the body to the trunk. Kimberly spent almost the entire day in the trunk of the car. The next night, the men drove to the airport where they transferred the girl to the plane along with the chains and cinder blocks. Jacob flew alone, soared over the Atlantic Ocean, past Cape May, and dropped the body. 2 days after his confession, Michael attempted to follow Jacob by hanging himself in his cell. But the guards arrived in time and saved him, barely pulling him back from the brink. If they had been a minute later, he would have been beyond help. Michael was offered a plea deal for second-degree murder and an 18-year sentence, but he chose to go to trial, believing he would be acquitted. He was wrong. On January 6, 2004, Michael was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The death penalty had not been abolished in Delaware, but the judge leaned towards a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge told Michael that Kimberly's relationship with her foster family was none of his concern. Instead of stopping Jacob, he had helped kill a 16-year-old girl who had done nothing to him. The motive for the crime remained unclear. Whether Jacob loved Kimberly and was dating her behind his girlfriend's back, as Michael claimed, or wanted to please Heather, who blamed Kimberly for the breakup of her family, as investigators suggested, or whether he genuinely hated the girl and wanted to eliminate her to end the problems she caused, as he told his father, was uncertain. Investigators wanted to get to the bottom of it and spoke with Heather one last time. Heather insisted she did not believe Jacob and Kimberly were seeing each other behind her back. According to Heather and other mutual acquaintances, Jacob hated Kimberly because she mocked him in front of Heather. So much so that he stopped visiting his girlfriend's home when Kimberly was there. Detectives found no evidence that Heather was involved in the sinister murder plot. The girl moved to Colorado, attended a community college, and continued to see a therapist for several years to cope with the trauma. Today, Kimberly Holton would be 37 years old. She has been gone longer than she lived on this earth. Had Kimberly been given a better start in life, everything might have turned out very differently. She might have become a veterinarian, as she had always dreamed. And her children might have played with the babies of her best friend, Destiny. But just when it seemed she was finding happiness in her foster family, it was ripped away from her, and the nightmares began anew. From childhood, she never knew whom to trust and believed these men. And when Kimberly went missing, everyone assumed it was just another runaway, and no one searched for her. There were no tearful appeals from parents on television, no flyers, no large-scale searches with tracking dogs and helicopters. Kimberly's case could have remained unsolved, and everyone might have thought she decided not to come back this time. But Jacob did not account for one crucial element of his plan: the ocean. The plane flew at such a high altitude that when Kimberly's body hit the water, it was akin to a concrete impact at 210 kilometers per hour. The cinder blocks shattered upon impact. This gap in Jacob's knowledge allowed the truth to surface along with Kimberly's body.